We are back. Senators, Twins, Rangers, Expos, too. Past, present, and future. I'm Ralph Tyko of the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and we have a panel of folks with us today that is going to knock your eyes out. I'm going to introduce first our co-hosts, Ron Rabinovitz and George Case III. And I'm going to turn it over to you guys first, George, and then Ron to introduce our esteemed guests. And we're going to talk a little ball today and enjoy our time together. So first, Mr. George Case.
Thank you very much, Ralph. It's my pleasure to really introduce to the audience Hank Thomas. Hank is the grandson of Walter Johnson and has written a wonderful book about his grandfather. Hank and I have known each other probably 20 years, and we had a very obvious connection to Washington baseball, and I certainly knew of Hank's grandfather, Walter Johnson, probably the greatest pitcher in Major League Baseball history. And we're very happy to have Hank with us today, and he can talk a little bit later about his book, Walter Johnson, Baseball's Big Train, his family relationship, the Walter Johnson family, and Washington baseball. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ron, and we'll hear from Hank in a little while.
Okay, thanks, George. My special guest here is Clyde Doepner. He's a very dear friend of mine. We've known each other for many years. Clyde is the Minnesota Twins official team curator and historian. Clyde has worked for the Twins since they held the first annual Twin Fest in the late 80s. At that time, he estimated that he had around 1,000 memorabilia items. He's an avid baseball fan, an avid Twins fan, and was asked to put together some displays for Twin Fest, which he now does annually. Since that time, he has collected over 7,000 memorabilia items. He is known as Clyde the Collector. He has come to know everything about the Twins, past and present. He is in charge of maintaining the team collection of historical history. A large variety of his items will rotate on display at Target Field throughout the season for fans to see. Clyde, it's an honor and a pleasure to have you with us.
Well, Ron, it's an honor to be on this panel with the group of people that are there. I wish we were all sitting, looking hand in hand and face to face here. It's just been an honor knowing you over the years and the message that you carried forth for so long. And anytime I can be part of a group that includes you and the other dignitaries, it's my honor to be on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Clyde. Thank you so much. I see you around Target Field. Everybody knows Clyde. He's so friendly. He's just the greatest guy in the whole world. And he's visiting with fans all the time and staff. I've never seen a man who's more friendly and wonderful. It's great.
Well, I hope my wife is listening to this so she knows just how friendly and nice I am.
Right. Okay. So, Ralph, you want to get started?
Well, I just want to say what an honor it is for me to have all four of you guys on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. And this is just going to be a great show. So I want to get started a little bit by just telling Clyde that I know that Tony Oliva's real name is Pedro.
Yep.
Am I correct?
You're heading in the right direction. You bet you are.
Okay, so you know I have a little bit of sense of what it's all about. As a matter of fact, I had the privilege of meeting Tony in Visalia, where the Twins had a Class A team in the California League, and Tony was a rover at the time for the Twins, and I don't know if he's still doing it, but what a gentleman. A credit to the organization, and a credit. Can you tell me how he was signed originally, and was he signed when they were still in Washington?
he was signed when Joe Cambria, the infamous, wonderful man that Clark Griffith was smart enough to send down to Cuba more or less and let him work that whole area. And my goodness, when you think of the teams of the Senators in the late 50s and transformed over in the Twins in 61, and you've got Pedro Ramos and Camilo Pascual and Julio Becquer, Julio's still up in our area here, and just a real gentleman and an important person in our franchise. You got Tony, you got Zoilo Versalles. I mean, you can go on and on. Joe Cambria signed over 400 people, Latinos,
wow.
And it would be hard to imagine. They brought Tony up here in 1962, and it's a long story, but he kind of hung on by his fingertips. He was just this young kid and wasn't the best outfielder, and he didn't have a real defensive position at the time, but oh my, could he hit a baseball. And a lot of people give credit to several individuals for kind of guiding him on, working with him. He was literally released after he first got here, and then didn't have a place to live, and they took him under wing and kind of in a minor league deal. And the more they looked at him, the more they realized what the potential he had. And so, no, he signed in the, like I said, in 62 when they really got Tony going in the organization. And, by 64, he's a rookie in the American League, and he wins the batting title. And 65, he wins the batting title again. And to this day, the only guy in history of baseball to have won the batting title his first 2 years. So, and
amazing.
How did he get hurt?
He got hurt making diving catches. He hurt his knees several times by making these, when you see them, just a type of diving catch that caused a lot of pressure on his knees. And he's had 7, I believe, knee surgeries. Still stands with one knee tucked in quite a bit. And obviously, had not it been for that, he would have gone on to, spectacular numbers. 2 years ago in the voting for the Hall of Fame, he missed the Hall of Fame by 1 vote from the old timers. And we're hoping.
A shame. He deserved to be in there.
Oh, he's just, when you look at him, three batting titles, and he certainly belongs, yes.
And what a sweet man.
I just want to say that the people that vote for the Hall of Fame, and they've changed the system so often, but collectively over the last 20, 30 years, they have really done a lot of folks misjustice or injustice. Gil Hodges,
right.
Dick Allen, you can make a Minnie Minoso, and I don't want to leave anybody out, but those
Tony,
are
of course.
obvious.
I mean, and Tony, yeah.
And Tony, yes.
Jim Cox.
Obviously, for a variety of reasons, not to even get into the Pete Rose, Shoeless Joe Jackson. It's a museum, for crying out loud. It's not a choir boy, this, that, and the other thing. I'm just speaking randomly off the top of my head. Tony would be a good candidate for folks to get behind if there's any hope now. Does he have a chance? We've been over, Ron and I, on several shows, Gil Hodges' chances. Does Tony have a chance to get in his lifetime?
I truly think he does. When you look at his statistics, I did a comparison about 4 years ago, and we produced a video. We produced a little dialogue amongst a group of us that either played with Tony or observed Tony. And that's why we thought when they voted 2 years ago, he's up in another 2 years again. And we certainly hope that I compared him to everyone from his time period, from even the late 50s on. So I compared him to Mantle, Mays, Aaron, Snyder. I didn't duck anybody. And the minimum requirement to be in the Hall of Fame, you have to play 10 full seasons. And I did a comparison between him and everyone else in 7 categories, everything from hits to home runs to doubles to stolen bases, et cetera. And he was in the 84th percentile. So he was in the top elite group if you look at his first 12 years versus their first 12 years. And then I said, if you're not going to vote him in because he doesn't have longevity, then I did one between pitcher A and pitcher B. I'm named in the example. And one pitcher, has 180 some victories, and another pitcher was around 180 victories. And one had a lot more strikeouts than the other.
I assume you're talking Sandy Koufax.
Yep, Sandy Koufax versus Jim Cott. And I said, if you voted Sandy in, and oh my, did he dominate one decade. But if you vote him in, then vote on Tony in the same circumstances, that he dominated 12 years. And if Sandy belongs in, and he does, Tony belongs in, and he does. So
absolutely.
I think that's a realistically way of doing it. There is a time for longevity, and there is a time for the requirement of 10 years. And I just hope that Tony gets his time. He's at every game. He works with our Latino players every game as a coach, and he's terrific. Does Hispanic baseball back, 4 days a week to the South, and I mean, he's just a wonderful human being.
I just wanted to mention a couple things. When you, Clyde, when you're talking about Tony Oliva and Jim Cott and Joe Cambria, my dad was signed by Joe Cambria, and was one of the few American players that Joe signed. And in addition, he also signed Early Wynn, who had been with the Twins as well. Yep. And, Jim Cott and Tony Oliva were both with the Twins in '68 when my dad was a third base coach. And I remember distinctly, my father talking about the talents of Tony as a hitter, and also the greatness of Jim Cott as a pitcher. So, I'm in the camp that would certainly like to see both Jim Cott and Tony Oliva in the Hall of Fame.
Well, that's coming from you and coming through your dad and so forth. That's I think as big a determining power in a vote right there as anyone, because the ability your dad had and everything was amazing. So yeah.
George, would you talk to your guest, and we'll keep going back and forth a little bit. A descendant of one of the greatest in all time. Take it, George.
Right. Well, what I wanted to really mention about Hank and Walter Johnson, Hank about 20 years ago wrote this book, which is, I think, the definitive biography of Walter Johnson. The key to it, in my opinion, because I've been in a baseball family, is the family aspect of it. Walter, everybody knows how great a pitcher he was, and his long career in the major leagues, and probably unsurpassed as far as pitching ability. But Hank made it on a personal level because his grandfather, he was part of the Johnson family, and there's wonderful photographs, family photographs, talking about Walter Johnson as a person as well as a player. And I also had a personal connection to Walter Johnson. I never knew Walter, obviously, but Clyde Milan, who was his best friend and teammate with Washington, was also my dad's base running coach, and had a strong connection to Washington. And in 1939, believe it or not, when my dad was playing for the Senators, Walter Johnson was in the broadcast booth. He broadcast Senators games one year. So I really would like Hank to talk about, Walter Johnson as far as his family and everything, and what he did when he wanted to put the anecdotes in the book, and how that book got started. And I think it's a very interesting story. So, Hank, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thanks, George. I'm curious as to whether that broadcast tape that exists, it's one of the earliest, you know what I'm talking about.
Yes, I do.
WJSV recorded the whole day as kind of a radio time capsule, and it just happened. I think it was by coincidence that there was a ball game that day, and my grandfather was the broadcaster that year and did that game, and they cut in at the fourth inning. I'm not sure why, but went from the fourth inning to the end. And that tape, you can find it on the internet if you just Google Walter Johnson radio broadcast or WJSV or some variation of that. You can hear it, and he's not bad. He's kind of a Will Rogers folksy type presentation. He wasn't supposed to be. That whole situation of how he ended up being the broadcaster that year is kind of amazing in and of itself. Not to get too far into it, but New York had a boycott. There had been for 4 years, all three of the New York teams had refused to broadcast their games on the basis that it would hurt attendance. Of all things.
Oh.
That was the theory. That was the theory back then, and you could see where they might think that, before, somebody realized, well, no, it's actually promoting the team and the games. But anyway, they broke that. And Walter was supposed to be. Mel Allen was actually hired by Washington to come down and do the broadcasts. I'm not sure what he had been doing in the meantime, but. And Walter was going to be his color guy, and Mel Allen ended up, Brooklyn hired Red Barber, broke the boycott, right. And then in response, the Yankees hired Mel Allen away from the job he was going to have at Washington, and so Walter ended up being the broadcaster. I guess Clark Griffith, being penurious as he was, decided to combine the salaries of the broadcaster and the color man and made Walter the whole thing. So anyway, but he's not bad. I mean, for a guy that, for a farmer and a ball player, he does all right. But I was curious, George, as to whether your dad was he in that game? Was he playing?
No, Hank, he was not. I was very excited when I learned about the tape. My dad was out that day, I guess, with an injury, but it was very interesting to me to listen to the tape because you could actually hear the crowd noises and the vendors at Griffith Stadium. It was wonderful. And the thing that struck me was that it was the year that Mickey Vernon was brought up to Washington, and your grandfather calls Mickey Jim because Mickey Vernon's nickname, Mickey, did
Jim
not
Vernon,
come until later in his career. So you hear Walter Johnson talking about Jim Vernon. And that was very interesting to me. That was a partial broadcast, as Hank had mentioned, from that radio station, and it does pick it up in the fourth or fifth inning. But I was very excited to listen to it because I had never heard Walter Johnson's voice, and it was great for me.
Yeah, most people hadn't.
To it.
Yeah,
right.
And you get
it was wonderful.
And also not to interrupt, you get to pick up on his sense of humor. He jibes the other guy, Harry McTighe, is I guess they did pick up another guy that spells him for a couple innings and sort of acts. They act as each other's color guys, and apparently McTighe hadn't shown up for a cereal box autographing session at this market in Northeast D.C. and he jibes him, and you get to see, and there's other moments where you get to see the human side of Walter Johnson because it's very spontaneous. I mean, he's got this whole game, and he weighs in on what he thinks about certain players and teams, and all the other clips of Walter that exist, sound, film clips, and whatnot, are sort of canned, where he's the manager, and they're asking him how the team's going to do this year. And so it's all kind of what you'd expect, whereas this broadcast has these moments, as I said, where you really get to the personality of Walter Johnson comes through.
Yeah, it was great, Hank. I had to laugh, too, at the end. They talk about Walter going to some grocery store to sign autographs or something.
Miller's Market. Walter Johnson will be at Miller's Market at 7th and D tonight.
I thought to myself, can you imagine a player of Walter's caliber today doing something like that? I mean, it was really interesting to listen to that. And as Hank said, it was great sense.
And he didn't get paid for that. Yeah,
No, I'm sure he did.
And so you buy a box of cereal, and then you have Walter Johnson autograph it. Kind of an early memorabilia mention too.
Absolutely. I wonder if
the
anybody had those cereal boxes.
Worth today with that box of cereal autographed by Walter Johnson.
Right.
Yeah, I've never seen one. I guess, in the middle of the Depression, who's going to actually not eat the cereal, just leave that box intact. But, yeah, I've never. Yeah, go ahead.
Speaking of memorabilia, Clyde, how did you get started with collecting all this memorabilia for the Twins?
Well, my wife isn't actually trained in that area, but she claims it's a defective gene. and she could be right. I've always just been a collector by nature. I had grandparents on both sides that lived on farms. And in the summer, I'd stay, it's all German, I'd stay with the Doepner side or I'd stay with the Stavano side. And I always brought something home. And I'd bring I got a picture of my room when I was about 9 years old, and my goodness, I have butter churn, and I have a kerosene lamp, and an egg carrier, and a spinning wheel, and every summer when I'd go to visit them, I'd bring something home that was in the old grain shed that wasn't being used anymore. And even though I played 3 sports, I love baseball, basketball, and football, I was a reader, and I would they'd go down to the library, and I'd look up something about kerosene lamps or something about inkwells or whatever. And I guess it was just natural when I started playing baseball. My dad was good at bringing me to things, and I have an Uncle Russ Doepner that's still alive and well. He's in his late 80s. And we went to a lot of baseball games, and if there was a cracked bat or a foul ball, and I've just always been a collector. My grandma gave me baseball books when I was 11 or 12, and I still have them, and the magazines from them. So, and the long story short is I knew Cal Griffith because back in 1966 I graduated from college, and when I got out, I was a baseball coach. I was lucky in high school. In 61, we were state baseball champs at North St. Paul High School, and went to college to play baseball. And when I got out, I was going to be the baseball coach at Little Pine Island, Minnesota. And I opened up my mail that accumulated, and there was a free season pass that had sat there all summer. Cal Griffith mailed them out a little late. And it was a free season pass for the 1966 season. When I opened it mid-August, still some time left in the year, so this is for the baseball coach. So that weekend, I went up to watch some free games at Met Stadium, and I was brought up to say thank you. So I looked up Cal and walked in his office and said, Cal, I want to thank you. What do you want to thank me for? He could be kind of a grumpy old curmudgeon. And I showed him the pass, and I said, well, you sent out this free season pass. And he said, well, what the heck's wrong with you? And I said, what do you mean? And he said, I've been giving those blankety-blank things away for 3 months, and you're the first guy that thanked me. What's wrong with you? I said, well, I was brought up to say thank you, but my mother never said it to be this tough, And so I was ready to leave, and he said, no, come here. And he took me down the hall to the left, to the right, and we were out in the Griffith seats. And when we walked out and sat down in the Griffith seats, and they were down the first base line at the Met. They were on the third base line at the Metrodome. And when he walked me out there, he said, now, when you come to a game, you sit in here at my family. You don't have to sit out there in the cheap seats with those thankless son of a guns. And that's how I got to know him. I went and sat with the family, and I could go to the clubhouse. I got a lot of free meals and a few beverages over the years. And then when they were moving out of the Met to the Metrodome, he found out all that stuff he brought from Washington, D.C. and stored free at the Met. And all the stuff he added from 61 to 81 while playing there, he found out, he could store that at the Metrodome, but he had to pay for the storage by the square foot. And he was too frugal at a sports convention. He was too frugal, so he told his brothers, throw everything. And I knew his brother Billy real well, and I went out there for 33 straight nights. And whatever they were pulling out of storage that day. And after the first week or so, a lot of it wasn't even properly gone through. I mean, he said, I'm not paying those guys. Don't waste your time going through it. So I went out there every night for those nights, and I got well over 3,000 items. And I brought a bunch of stuff into Cal one day and said, Cal, you're throwing stuff away that's so valuable. And I got plenty of money. I said, I'm not talking about money. I'll never sell it. I never have. I'm talking about the history of baseball. I mean, letters from presidential first pitches and things like that, because they always officially started baseball in the nation's capital when the president threw out the first pitch. I mean, that tradition went all the way back to 1910 with President
Cincinnati in the other league.
Yep, and you're
they don't
exactly
do that
right. So can you imagine a history teacher having all of this material? I mean, my students benefited with that for years. And when I brought it back in, he said, Clyde, it's a gift. It's yours. You're the baseball nut. I'm giving it to you. He said, just don't bring it back in here. I have to empty this place, and you're not helping me. Over the years, everybody knew. I mean, I could, when he went to the Metrodome, I would be in a suite with him watching baseball. And Game 7, I thanked him in '87 for selling the team to someone that kept it in our area. And it was a wonderful relationship. And like I said, they knew it. So going way back to, well, '89 was our first official Twins Fest, but I'd done a lot of displays before that. I started doing displays, and it became known what I had. And it just gradually got bigger and bigger till I went full-time about 10 years ago as their official curator. So long story
short.
This
is Hank Thomas. Can I throw a story in here?
Oh, I'd love to sit with you for hours.
Add to your amazing story, which I'd love to talk to you more about. I have a letter from Ossie Bluegee in the late 70s. I had written him when I was first starting to get seriously interested in my grandfather's career. Just as a hobby on my part, no intention to end up with a book or anything like that. I wrote the Twins. I actually wrote Calvin Griffith and asked him about what the Twins had in the way of files or other things relating to my grandfather that they had taken from Washington to Minnesota. And I got a letter from Cal saying that he had turned the matter over to Ossie Bluegee, who had been a good friend of my grandfather's. And I guess Bluegee was the comptroller, maybe, of the Twins at that time.
Yeah, he was kind of a jack of all
treasurer.
Trades. Had done a lot of things, and that's what he became at the end of his career. Yep.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether he was a CPA or not, but anyway. So I get a letter shortly thereafter from Ossie Bluegee, in which he said some very nice things about his association with Walter and what a great guy and pitcher Walter was and stuff. And then at the end, he said, unfortunately, our move from Washington to Minnesota was done, in a very abrupt manner, or something to that effect, and that none of the files relating to the old team and its players. I'm not sure he said that they all, we put them in the dumpster or anything like that, but that was the gist of it. And oh my gosh, I'm thinking, wow, nobody. So I'd be very interested to talk to you, Clyde, at some point and see what actually they did take. But boy, I mean, just think of how much they didn't. That
well, see, that's what I was surprised at. They had a file on your grandfather, but it had like 7 items in it. I mean, most of what the Washington Senators had, because of the way they quickly got out of the city, was tossed. Because I asked, there just isn't much Washington Senator stuff, and he said, well, you'd have to do some dumpster diving for that. And that, that infers they did. I have a booklet that was in there when they had Walter Johnson Day at the stadium. And then one thing I obtained years
Which
ago.
one? Was that the one from his 20th anniversary, the sepia?
Right. This is
that's a beautiful piece.
Yeah, and then I have a long photograph. When I say long, it's probably 14 inches high and 36 inches long. And it's not an original one, and it didn't come from Griffith. It came from a restaurant that closed up here a long time ago, and I received a copy, the picture. And it's called Walter Johnson Day at the stadium, and it shows both teams lined up at home plate. And I would love to. I'll get that. I'd love to get together with you and show you that.
Oh,
so that's something I got separate from the Griffith items, but I've displayed that when we had a movie here, a play here, a music called Damn Yankees, and of course it's basically about the Senators.
Sure.
And in that I did a display of the history of the Senators, and that was something I was very proud to include by celebrating the greatest pitcher in my mind in baseball. And
I won't argue with that. Yeah.
Oh, you can't.
I won't argue with it either.
Good for you for saving all that stuff, Clyde. I mean, that really, I'm a collector too. I have that gene, and also I've been dealing part-time, more or less, for 20 years in old Senator stuff. And good for you for saving that stuff. I mean, it just, the idea that back then, I mean, there wasn't any value. There wasn't an organized market in this stuff, and people.
People were still
the idea that he wouldn't pay the storage. The storage fees.
I also wanted to mention something, Hank, and you might want to talk about this. You had some wonderful opening day baseballs that were signed by Presidents of the United States that you had donated, I believe, to the Hall of Fame. And if I have the story correct, but you might want to elaborate on it, they went missing. And you might want to talk about that because I thought it was very, very
I'd love to hear that story, Hank. Share that with us.
Well, I mean, my grandfather was the pitcher in 1910. He was the starting pitcher when President Taft, who actually was the last minute, this wasn't any organized trip to the opening day of the ball season in D.C., the president just wanted to get out of the White House. So he grabbed the vice president, Sherman, and said, hey, they're starting the season today. Let's go to the ball game. So they went, and Jimmy McAleer, the Washington manager, was smart enough to think, oh, my gosh, we have the president here. Well, let's have him, let's do something ceremonial. So they had him, open the season by tossing a baseball to the starting pitcher. Well, who was the starting pitcher? It was Walter Johnson. And even though Walter was just 22, he had only been there for several seasons, but he was smart enough to realize, well, I'm not using this ball. This is, I'm not just going to play the game with this thing. So he put it aside. There was some associate of his, somebody that he knew that worked in the White House, and the next day took that ball to the White House when he went to work there, and Taft wrote, this is what he wrote, Walter pitched one of the very great games of his career. The only base runner was a ground rule double into the roped-off crowd in the outfield because they had an overflow crowd for the opening day. Otherwise, it would have been a perfect game. And this was against the Athletics, who ended up being world champions that year. It was one of the really great games in Walter's career. So this is what Taft wrote on the ball before he signed it. He wrote, to Walter Johnson, in the hope that he shall always be as formidable as in yesterday's game, William Howard Taft. So, fast forward now, Walter's there for 20 years. And he's always pitching the opening day. So he ended up with 5 different presidents signing the opening toss, which before we remember from the 50s and 60s that the presidents would toss the ball into a crowd of players and they would scramble for it. But that didn't start till later, and I'm not sure when that started, but during Walter's time, the ball was thrown to the pitcher to start the game. So, and Walter was always the opening day pitcher in Washington. So he ended up with 5 different presidents: Taft, Wilson, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. This collection of 5 opening day baseballs. So try to fast forward the story. Again, if you get on the internet, I wrote a long piece in the Washington Post magazine about 10 years ago, laying out this whole amazing saga of. So my uncle, who had that collection, donated it to the Hall of Fame in 1968. I went up there again as an early instance of interest in my grandfather's career. I went up to the Hall of Fame to spend a few days in the late 70s and was ushered into Ed Stack, the president's office, to be told the very sad news that those balls had been stolen from the Hall of Fame in 1972.
And they've never.
Well, we were devastated, and they also they pulled the cover up. This had happened 7 years before, and they had done nothing. They hadn't even. They were scared. They didn't want to tarnish their reputations, and they also, their excuse to us was, well, we didn't want to publicize the fact because that would encourage further thefts and that kind of, while we were upgrading the security of the hall and blah 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 blah. But the upshot was they weren't going to tell anybody. They were just going to let it go.
What a
and how was anybody going to know where that the balls had been stolen if they didn't tell? So we were that gave us a very jaundiced view of the Hall of Fame But now, fast forward again and into the 90s, and all of a sudden, I'm not just a collector of old Washington stuff and other material, but I'm a dealer. I started, like most collectors, to defray the spending all this money on my stuff. I started doing shows, and now the hobby's getting very organized, and there's these shows, and there's these elaborate catalogs, beautiful color catalogs with this stuff. And believe it or not, in 1998, the Warren Harding ball popped up in an auction.
No.
I forget what the auction was, but anyway, and that ball there was 2 of them that had inscriptions, the Taft ball and the Harding ball, where they had written more than just signed their name. And so I spotted it, and I knew immediately what it was. And I called the Hall of Fame. They called the FBI. Took several years, but they ended up recovering all 5 of these.
No kidding.
The entire collection.
That's wonderful.
Isn't that
is a great ending to that story.
Well, it's incredible. I mean, it's almost like I felt this way doing my book a few times, but you start to feel like you're being directed by a force greater than yourself, and I'm like, well, my gosh, maybe I just, I became a collector and a dealer just so I'd be in a position. I mean, nobody else but me would have noticed that. It just would have gone, and that thing would have gone, and the other balls would have come out and bought and sold and ended up in private collections, and nobody ever would have known the difference. So anyway, the great news is that entire collection ended up back in the Hall of Fame. And you can read, there's more to the story than I've laid out here. And if you get on the Internet and you Google Walter Johnson opening day baseballs, Washington Post, something like that, you can read all about it.
That is
a great story, Hank. Hey, Hank, thanks for sharing that. That's a wonderful
story. Oh, yeah.
Well, that's worth
George,
everybody tuning in.
I got to add one thing. When you're talking about presidents throwing out the first ball, the first time George was on these airwaves, he told a story that I'll never forget about opening day. You want to repeat it, if you would, George, and who you got?
Well, it was a little bit different, quite a bit different than Hank's story. But in 1961, it was the first year of the expansion Senators, and John F. Kennedy was the president and was throwing out the first ball at Griffith Stadium. And I had worked out with the ball club before the game. I'd taken infield practice, batting practice, went in, took a shower, and got cleaned up and put on a suit, and I was sitting in the Washington dugout. And when President Kennedy comes in with his entourage and goes into the presidential box, and I'm sitting there on the Washington dugout all by myself. The ball clubs are lined up on the first and third base lines, and suddenly I'm surrounded by Secret Service, and they're demanding to know who I am. And how could I be sitting there next to the President of the United States? And I said, hey, my dad's a coach for the ball guy. I said, who's your father? And I had to point out my dad. My dad had to come into the dugout. He had to say, yes, that is my son, so they would let me sit there. Otherwise, I was going to be arrested. So that's my opening day of 61 story.
That's a great story. Hank, do you have a picture of your grandfather with the president shaking his hand?
Oh,
in 19.
Yeah, there are pictures of him with presidents.
Yes, we have a picture around Dave St. Peter, and between the Polad family that owns the team and Dave St. Peter, the president, they enabled me to do what Clyde, the curator, does, is collect and display, and I owe so many thanks to them. All around Dave St. Peter's office, down the hallway and around his office, one of my first assignments was we framed up, and we've got, they must all be 24 by 30-some inch pictures, all professionally matted and framed, of every first pitch by a president, or of every president being represented. And, of course, the first one is a photograph of your grandfather, Walter Johnson, shaking hands with President Taft. And we have a big photo of that.
I have never seen that. I suspect that that's not Walter. I think that's Clark Griffith, actually.
Okay. I'd love to show that to you.
I'd love to see it. Yeah, I've never seen it. Yeah, I've seen a picture of it. There are a couple of pictures that I've seen from that opening day. But yeah, there's pictures of him, let's see, with Harding, with Coolidge. There's a bunch with Coolidge because his wife, Grace Coolidge, was a tremendous baseball fan. Calvin, not so much. But he was running for re-election in 24 during that magical season of the Senators. And so he got involved. He had the team to the White House, and he went to 3 games of the World Series. And it wasn't, he was running for re-election, but it was his wife, I'm sure, who insisted that they go to the games. And she actually kept score. She knew how to keep score at a ball game. She was a big fan. So there's lots of pictures with Hoover. There's pictures of Walter, plenty of pictures of him standing next to Herbert Hoover, when Walter was the manager, and Hoover's throwing out the opening pitch, and Walter standing next to him, as traditionally the managers did, and Clark Griffith is also in all of those pictures. So there's a number, and he knew FDR pretty well. I won't say that they were friends. I don't think they went hunting together or anything like that, but they were on a first-name basis from Roosevelt's time as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the 8 years of Wilson's presidency. And Roosevelt was a huge baseball fan, and he went to lots of ball games. And there's a wonderful letter that Roosevelt wrote to Walter on his 50th birthday. They had a banquet for him at the Mayflower and all like that. So there are all kinds of, even extending to Lyndon Johnson, of all things, because in 1945, opening day took place several days after Roosevelt had died. And so Clark Griffith called up Walter to come out and add some luster to the opening day, since they wouldn't have the president that year. And the person that threw out the first pitch was the Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn. And, of course, his great protege standing right behind him is Lyndon Johnson. So there's Lyndon Baines Johnson, standing next to Walter Johnson behind Rayburn as he throws out. So there was the presidential connection, obviously, because, Washington, D.C., and probably the only one of the few people that would have more of a connection with baseball and presidents would have been Clark Griffith, who I know I've seen pictures of Clark Griffith's office, and I hope Calvin didn't throw these away. Maybe Clyde could address that. But in the background of all these pictures, George, I'm sure you've seen these too, or maybe even been there when you were a kid. But Griffith's office was just covered with these pictures of presidents and other politicians at the ballpark.
And I think, Hank, to elaborate on that, I'm very sad that I guess the opening day tradition is no longer tradition, because that was something that they really looked forward to, having the President of the United States
throw the first ball. It's pathetic that they have not restored that. I just do not understand why baseball would forego that opportunity. Not to brag or anything, but in 2010, I called up Jeff Idelson, who I had gotten to know on several occasions, and said, President of the Hall of Fame, and I said, Jeff, does anybody realize that the 100th anniversary of the first presidential opening toss is going to take place this year? And this is about a month before the season was going to start, and he said, well, gosh, we didn't realize it. And I said, well, how about calling the White House, and see? And that's the only reason that they got, President Obama, not a baseball fan, but he did go out that year. That's the one toss that he did, and I think it started with my phone call, just alerting them to the fact, so I'm sure Clyde knows this, that there's just, not everybody's kind of a nutcase on this stuff like we are, and on the history, and why baseball? Once D.C. got a team back in 2005, you explain that to me, why they would not want to restore. The presidents have come out a couple times. George Bush came out to open the ballpark in 2008. And then Obama came out in 2010 for the 100th anniversary. I think those are the only two. But why, start the season like they used to, in D.C. and Cincinnati a day early and make a big deal out of it. Why wouldn't you want to do that?
I agree. I can't understand it either, and it's always been something that's bothered me because of the fact that, you and I were both associated, obviously, so it's of great interest to us. But on a national level, it's a tremendous opportunity.
Why wouldn't you glom on to that history? That's
absolutely. The history of baseball began in Cincinnati, and then with the Washington opening day tradition, they always opened a day early. And that was
such a cool thing. We'd skip school,
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
When I got some of the memorabilia, I can give you a long story short. There were these letters from presidents of the United States. There are letters from wives of presidents. There's letters from J. Edgar Hoover and other people related in the whole government area of it all. But for example, Eisenhower's first year, he writes a letter saying, "I'm looking forward to the honor of throwing out the first pitch." And it's on White House stationery, and it's, Eisenhower talking about the thrill. And right behind it's a letter because every year was in chronological order. Right behind it would be a letter from Rawlings Sporting Goods saying, "We saw where Ike is going to throw out the first pitch. We're sending a glove out with his name on it." And the inference was, of course, get the glove in the pitcher, because if you notice, a third of the time they're wearing a glove. And sometimes it can even be turned a little funny because someone would reach in. They wanted to make sure Rawlings got in the photograph that would be in every newspaper, large and small. It's called Econ 101. So there's this letter from Rawlings. Then right after it, a couple of days later, is another letter from Rawlings saying, "We heard that Ike isn't going to throw out the first pitch. He's going golfing instead. So we're sending out a glove with Nixon, his vice president's name on it. In effect, get it in the picture." Right behind that would be a letter from Nixon saying, "I get to throw out the first pitch. My wife and I are looking forward to it," etc. And then right behind that is a telegram from former President Truman, who already decided he didn't like Nixon. And in the telegram, he says, saw where Nixon is throwing out the first pitch. Don't let him throw you a curve. And now think about the baseball fit right into the recent election. And see, and then there was a beautiful letter from Mamie Eisenhower apologizing for not being able to come. There would be a letter, from every wife of a president thanking for, he always gave, he being Clark, and then Cal continued the tradition. Thanks for the beautiful alligator handbag. Thanks for the season pass. Thanks for this. Thanks for that. Well, can you imagine a history teacher getting?
Do you have that letter from Nixon in your collection, from Truman in your collection about Nixon? Oh,
definitely. I've got it. In fact,
my God.
I came out with a book a couple of years ago, Minnesota Twins True Memorabilia. And in that book, I just tell the history of kind of baseball. And Stu Thornley and I put a book together, and Jerry Stebbins, a well-known photographer, did the photographs. And there's a couple of hundred color photographs. It's a coffee table book. And in there, I tell all these stories. I'm kind of like Paul Harvey. Here's the rest of the story. I like being a storyteller. And in there, it tells the story about that. And I did include the Truman, nice color photograph of the Truman telegram stating that. Yep.
Fantastic.
Well,
Clark Griffith.
You're going to have to come back week after week and tell us your stories. But I want to ask Hank, do you have family recollections of you and your grandfather?
No, I was 8 months old when he died, so I did not know him. I mean, obviously, my mom is still alive. His daughter, she's 94. And, I grew up hearing lots of stories about him. Not so much on the baseball side, just as
as a human.
As a human, as a father, as the family can, I felt, but I tell people, I try to explain that I did not write the book. Obviously, my opinion is that Walter Johnson was the greatest pitcher, certainly one of them. I mean, there's actually about 10 guys that you can make a case for. You can really mount a good case for about 10 different pitchers. And, I won't go into all the reasons. I did in my book. I did an appendix where I laid out the case. Was he the greatest? And I sort of laid out the case. Put in a little bit against, but mostly the four. But I didn't write the book, because he was my grandfather. And it's like, here's, he needs a book about him because he was the greatest pitcher. But the way I explain it, because he was my grandfather, I got to know not just the baseball side, but the personal side too, which was a big deal in his time. The baseball players, the great players, kind of got to be archetypes of the human condition. Everybody, Babe Ruth was just the fun-loving, the friendliest guy in the world, and that was his archetype. Ty Cobb was the fighter, the brawler, the win at any cost type guy. And lots of other players had different, just as they do in this time and they did when we were growing up. Well, Walter's archetype was the nice guy. And there's all these stories about that I got to read about in my research about how grateful the hitters were of his time that was the case. And there's very few
wasn't
pitchers.
A headhunter.
Well, exactly, which you don't have to be a headhunter, but pitchers have always regarded a high and inside fastball is like, you know, you got your fastball, your curve, you got your variety of pitchers, and then you've got that if you need it as sort of another pitch. And when the the hitters are digging in to you, or somebody's hitting you really well, you know, it's sort of, and there's no lack of pitchers back then and in this time that would just put one in a batter's back to let every other hitter know, you know, I've got this fastball and I can put that thing in your ribs if I want to. So, you know,
you ain't escaping it.
Exactly. You know, you better, you know, be loose up there. And but Walter being just a sweet, everybody used the word sweet about him, which is, you know, strange because he's this big, strong guy with this awesome weapon, and yet they said, oh, what a sweet man he was. And he was a gentle, modest guy who, there's the stories are legion about the times that he did hit players, and he would have to, there was occasions where he had to leave the game. It upset him so much when he'd hit a player, and you know, no batting helmets back then, and he'd hit someone in the head and they'd go down, and he was afraid that they might have died. And so anyway, so that became, so he never, the players all said the same thing. He said, oh yeah, he was the fastest pitcher I ever faced. But he said, but I'd rather bat against Walter, because you knew he was one of the few pitchers that wasn't going to throw at you.
Hank, how did he get his nickname Big Train? How did he get his nickname Big Train?
That's a long story that I spent a couple of weeks trying to figure that out. And I did. It's kind of a long story. It actually had to do with, in 1914, he got, signed away. He actually signed with the Federal League, outlaw league, that, as they called it, a third league, that started up, and, he was a bit upset because the Senators offered him a $500 raise after a season in which he had won 28 games. And the reasoning, the publicly stated reasoning by the president of the Senators at the time, Benjamin Miner, was that, well, yeah, he won 28 games, but he was way down from the year before when he won 36. So they offered him a $500 raise for this lousy season that Johnson had in which he only won 28 games. And meanwhile, Joe Tinker, who was running the Chicago Whales of the Federal League, came to him and offered him. So the Senators offered him $7,500. And Tinker came and offered him a 3-year contract at $20,000 a year. So Walter signed that contract, and then Clark Griffith ends up, who was managing the Senators at the time, ends up going to Kansas and shaming Walter into, they had a meeting at a hotel in Kansas City at which Walter comes out with tears rolling down his eyes. And you can just picture Clark Griffith, you know, just begging Walter to come back to Washington because otherwise, you know, it'd be the end of Griffith's career and the team. God knows what he used to guilt Walter into coming back, but Walter did, and he reneged on that contract, and so there was a big legal situation now, and it's probably the lousiest thing Walter ever did in his life was to renege on that contract, but he did, and so in 1915 spring training, it was, nobody knew, what Walter Johnson, where he was going to play. Was he going to show up for Washington? Was he going to show up for, Chicago? Who was he going to play for? There's this legal situation. So a sports writer with Washington, who was only there for a couple of years. He wrote, so Walter was scheduled to show up they announced, he's going to play for Washington. He's reneging on the Federal League contract. And who cares, because it's an outlaw league anyway. And so Walter is scheduled to show up. And the day that the sports writer said the big train that was supposed to bring Walter Johnson into the spring training camp arrived, and there was no Johnson. So and the reason it was a story is like, oh my gosh, well, maybe he's not going to show up, blah, blah, blah. And so a couple of days later, I guess the sports writers, somehow that epithet, the big train, stuck in his mind, and the next day, or a couple of days later, he used it directly in relation to Walter Johnson. Walter Johnson, the big train of the Washington pitching staff. Something like that. Isn't that something?
That's outstanding.
Yeah. So,
Hank, is that in your book? Did you tell that story in your book?
Oh, yeah. Oh, sure. As I said, I spent a couple of weeks. And the reason I spent so much time on it was somehow it had gotten Grantland Rice's use of epithets, of all these famous epithets that Grantland Rice used for ball players. Right. The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, yep. And all of these, the Georgia Peach, I think he put on Tyko, and some others. And so I read all these articles later in the 20s and the 30s about how Grantland Rice had given Walter Johnson the nickname the Big Train. But then there was a very extensive magazine article by Grantland Rice in, I don't know, the late 20s or early 30s about Walter Johnson, and he doesn't call him the Big Train once. And that made me very suspicious of the idea that Grantland Rice had actually given him the name. So I decided to take some time, like I did with other things. It just, nobody else but me would be crazy enough. But I didn't, I mean, that was my approach to the biography period. I wanted to get the whole story, and, and I'm in Washington, so I've got the Library of Congress and all of their resources that's the other thing about the book, that I had those resources at my disposal. And so I was sort of in between careers. So I lived at the Library of Congress for a year. And they have every small town. The WPA went and microfilmed. One of the WPA projects in the 30s was to microfilm all of these small town newspapers all over America. And in small towns, the Sunday ball games, the town ball, as they called it, the town ball games were a big deal, and they got a lot of coverage.
Sure. It was very big.
Yeah. So I could trace Walter's early career. He never played in the minor leagues, but he had an extensive career in what they called the Bush Leagues, semi-pro. First in California, where his family had moved to from Kansas when Walter was 14, and then he went up to Idaho.
What part of California did they live?
Outside of L.A., Fullerton, a town called Olinda that doesn't exist anymore. But Fullerton, he went to Fullerton Union High School. Kevin Costner went to Fullerton High School. That area, Brea.
State University
Anaheim.
Now.
Anaheim. He pitched for Anaheim. He pitched for Santa Ana for several years, and that's how Walter, when he was 16, he got picked up by these semi-pro teams. He was playing kids ball, and they saw how he could throw. And it's amazing that he got scouted several times. Pop Dylan of the Los Angeles Angels scouted him twice and turned him down because he thought his pitching style was awkward or just these weird excuses. Here's this guy. I mean, seriously, there was never any development time in Walter's career that I could find. He could, right from the beginning, it was just a natural talent that he had. And there was no learning curve.
Was there a family time when he wasn't nice, as you say, he was known as being nice? Did he show his humanity in some ways that might be questionable, or
that's a great question, and it was something I was very interested in. And the bottom line is no. And it's not just family. It's he almost got into a fight with Jack Dunn, who was managing. Walter managed Newark of the International League one year, and it was reported in the paper that Walter and Dunn had words that the players thought could possibly break out into a fight, and I can't even imagine anybody thinking about taking on Walter Johnson in a fight. And I'm sure Dunn, who probably had a temper, but even he thought better of it. But so I asked my Uncle Ed, who lived with him on the Ed became a farmer like Walter was. Walter, after he retired, he bought a big farm outside D.C. in Germantown, Maryland, a 550-acre farm, and became a farmer again. Well, he really had never stopped being a farmer, and that's what he loved. And so I asked Ed, I interviewed my uncle at great length about his father, and he was older. Mom came along. She doesn't remember much of. She was one of the later children, and she doesn't remember much of his career. And she was 23, I guess, when her father died. Tragically, Walter was fairly young, 59 when he died. But Ed was older, and so I asked Uncle Ed, and I said, "Did you ever see him? Get mad? Did he ever get mad? He just seemed like a perfect person from everything everybody says." And I have the audio tape, and there's this long pause, and Ed's thinking, and his eyes are rolling. Boy, and he says, "Well, I do remember this one time." And of course I perk up, I'm like, "Oh, okay, we got a story coming here." He says, I remember this one time we were in the barn milking the cows, and this cow kicked over this full bucket of milk. Walter just spent 5 minutes filling this bucket with milk, and this cow just kicked it with his hind leg and knocked it over. He says, "I remember Dad standing up and just looking at this cow, and he said, 'Goodness gracious.'"
Boy, that's losing control.
It wasn't so nice.
That is, boy, isn't that,
That's really losing control.
That's the best that his son could come up with,
Isn't that
far as
wow.
Yeah,
Hey, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
What's for public presentation here? What's the name of your book and so forth and so on? Get that down for everybody sitting there waiting when they listen to this, saying, "What's the name of his book?"
Okay.
So can you give us that
Walter Johnson. It's the title is Walter Johnson, Baseball's Big Train, and it's still in print 20 years later. You can get it on Amazon, and it probably Barnes & Noble still stocks it, the paperback version, and you can actually get used hardcovers on Amazon too.
And you're listed as the author, of course. Yep.
Oh yeah, Henry W. Thomas. I got Shirley Povich. Bless his soul, lived long enough to write the foreword, and he knew Walter very well, covered him first as a...
Gentlemen, we have to get Maury Povich on for his memories of all of this. George, did you know Maury growing up?
I didn't know Maury. I certainly knew Shirley, and matter of fact, Shirley inducted my dad into the D.C. All-Stars in 1989, so I do not have a personal connection to Maury, but certainly I must tell you, he's a far cry from the reserved, quiet, dignified Shirley Povich.
That's all.
Shirley was very proud of Maury, though. I mean, Shirley was quick to because people, the whole family there was a family of overachievers. The Poviches have all made their mark on the world. When David, famous lawyer with Williams and Connolly, and Maury and stuff, and Shirley told me a couple of times. I mean, he was very quick to say how proud he was of Maury, even though his TV show might have tended to the sensational a little bit. They did a book, David and Maury did a book of Shirley's, about Shirley's career, and with some of his greatest columns. They'd be happy to be on the show, I think, Ron, if you could get a hold of them.
Yeah, those columns have to be wonderful, Hank. I think it was called This Morning. It was in the Washington Post for years.
I started my day with that column.
Yeah, from my understanding.
Probably starting when I was about 10 years old. I bet you did too, George.
Yeah, some of the politicians, I've heard stories that their first reading every morning, not so much about the world affairs, but they had to see what Shirley Povich had to say in his column in the Washington Post.
He was a column in the sporting news.
He was great.
But I lived on the East Coast and didn't get the Washington paper, but did get the sporting news. And I still want to know, is Neil Chrisley going to make it? Maybe, Washington guy.
I remember Neil Chrisley.
All right.
Make it to what?
Make it to what? He made it to the big leagues, as my friends would say. How bad is that?
Right.
I
remember him.
He was supposed
I had
to be
his
the
card.
next coming. Yeah, I did too. And don't we wish we had those cards? But it sounds like you've got them, and you've got every collectible. I'll tell you what, the story about Truman and Nixon will stick with me for the rest of my life.
That was great.
That's a classic.
That was terrific.
It's a classic. It transcends baseball. It's just Ron and I laughed in the same way, and I'm sure when that Walter Johnson fastball came into somebody's back, Ron was thinking Campy and Jellyfish and Jellyfoot.
That's right.
Right?
That's right. That's right. Exactly. It was.
He wouldn't have hung in there. Campy wouldn't have hung in there to be hit by Walter Johnson.
No.
Hey, listen, guys, this has been terrific. I just want to thank you all. I am certainly never felt more like a weak link than I have on today's broadcast. You guys are tremendous. Ronnie and George will be back next week, same time, same place. You guys come back as visitors whenever, and please often. This has been fun for me.
Clyde,
thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me on.
Thanks for being on.
I'm honored to just be a mouse in the corner and listening to these stories. You guys made my whole week here. Thank you.
Thanks for doing it, Ron.
Thank you for being, and Henry, thank you too.
Quite welcome.
George,
that was great fun.
You had fun too.
Yep. Take care, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
See you, George.
Be back next week.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Over and out.
Goodbye.
I'm out.